we go. All right, so Roz, would you like me to start the intro to RCEN?
Can I just say a little bit about the SDG caucus before? We do want to talk about what the RCEN is. And so the SDG caucus, actually, we started late in 2021. I think we had our first meeting in November. And we've seen a lot of growth in the work of the interests of the caucus. And I think it's also parallel to the interest in the sustainable development goals that we're seeing. RCEN is an organization that's national, and it's a consortium or a collective of environmental groups that work locally. Maddie's going to say a little bit about RCEN. I conceive of the SDG caucus as being located sort of at the nexus between the environmental concerns of Canadian Environmental Network, the concerns about biodiversity and nature protection, and all of these other values that we have, and how it connects with the SDGs. We have had a number of guests over the last year, including youth from the Sustainable Development Challenge here in the Okanagan. We've heard from legal experts who have talked a little bit about the SDGs from a legal perspective, and we have a report on that. Some of us were involved with the Together Ensemble national meeting of the UN SDSN in Canada. And we've also written to the Federal Ministry of Environment regarding the review of the Sustainable Development Strategy that the government introduced last year. The final version of that Sustainable Development Strategy is now available, and so that might be something that people want to add to their resource libraries. We've had a lot of discussion with the members of the SDG caucus as well as the affiliates of RCEN, and we have distilled 4 main themes out of those discussions that kind of animate the work of the SDG caucus. I won't say much more about that except to say that they're on our website, and we really urge you to take them to heart and think about how they might work for you and how they might work in your organization. So I'm going to turn to Maddie. She's going to say a little bit about RCEN, and then we will be turning to our guest speaker, Kate Potter, today, who's going to tell us a little bit about the Canadian Biosphere Reserve Association. I would just ask that if you've attended before, some of it might be familiar. If you have not, then it will be new information. We look forward to reaching out to you and getting your feedback in the weeks and months to come about what we could be doing as an SDG caucus. And I would just ask you at this point to hold any questions that you might have, because we will have a question period afterwards. So thank you again. Very nice to see you all. And I'll turn it over to Maddie.
Awesome, thank you. So can everyone see this? Yeah, okay, cool. It's in Canva, so it's not always, doesn't work how I always think it's going to. So welcome everyone. If this is your first time at Canadian Environmental Network event, I'm going to be giving a sort of overview of what we do here and how you can get involved. So we've been around since the 1970s, and we are a nonpartisan, non-for-profit network of environmental organizations and affiliate networks. And our main mission is to support environmental and sustainable policy through public participation. So we act as a bridge between grassroots environmental groups, both large and small, and the federal government. So as a network, we provide policy contribution for the government, and this fulfills Canada's mandate on transparency and consultation. We also enhance collaboration among environmental non-governmental organizations, or ENGOs, so that they can collaborate and work more effectively and support each other's work across the country. And we also increase the visibility and voices from local groups so that they can consult with the government on all elements of our society and experiences in our everyday lives. So there's a few avenues for collaboration that we use. One of those being our national caucuses, such as this caucus. This is where people can come together to work on environmental issues and policies. These caucuses also allow us to choose delegates to send to government consultations and UN events. For example, in December, we sent a few people to the COP15 conference in Montreal for the UN Biodiversity Convention, which was pretty cool. And finally, we connect and network with other environmental groups. So through events, newsletters, resources, we provide those for our network and for the public. So our national caucuses, I think we have 4 of them that are active right now, including our SDG caucus. So caucuses are formal working groups of environmentalists with expertise or interest in a specific environmental issue or policy. And they provide a voice for these organizations or their members to collaborate and to provide input on certain consultations. And then we can provide advice to the government, to other environmental organizations, to industry or the private sector, and to international organizations such as the UN. So if you're interested in joining one of our caucuses or being a part of our network, we have 2 memberships available. So first one is Class A, and this will be for people from environmental, non-governmental organizations. It's a mouthful. So the fees will range from $15 a year to $100 per year, sort of depending on the size of your organization and your status as a member with another affiliate network. And then we have our Class B non-voting membership. So this is for pretty much everyone else, individuals, other organizations such as businesses. And this one's $35 per year. So yeah, so if you're interested in learning more about us, you can visit our website. You can also send us an email at info@rcen.ca. And then for anything related to the SDGs or the SDG caucus, you can send an email to sdg@rcen.ca. And I'm going to put the link to our membership on our website so that you can go there right now if you feel the need. So let me just put that there. So our application form's on there and a little more information about what the membership entails. So yeah, with that, I'll send it back to Roz.
Thank you so much, Maddie, for that quick introduction. This is an organization that I'm really committed to, and I think has a lot to offer in terms of making the voice of the environmental movement, bringing it forward, and also connecting with the grassroots. So for that reason, I noticed that there's at least 1 or 2 people from the steering committee of the SDG caucus on the call. Nicole, are you here? And I just ask you to maybe turn on your camera and let us know where you are, so anybody in your area knows that they can connect with you. Nicole?
I don't think she's on the call anymore. She might have got.
Oh, she's not on the call anymore.
Yeah.
Is anyone else from the steering committee here? Okay, well, thanks very much. We do have members of the steering committee that are located across the country in different communities. And if you get in touch with us, we can connect you with someone who's in your area. I'm so happy to have Kate Potter here to speak to us about the Canadian Biosphere Reserve Association, such an important organization. And I know that she has a wealth of resources and information to share with us. So welcome to Kate Potter.
Thanks, Roz. And Maddie, you're going to share my presentation. I just asked that when I'm presenting, Roz said we're going to keep the questions to the end, so you can make sure everyone's muted as we go through. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the biospheres are doing. And if I don't know the answer, I'm sure I have people on the ground who can find the answer for you. And there's a wide range of activities and projects that we're involved in, SDGs, and well, everything is kind of framed within the SDGs, isn't it? Anyway, so my name is Kate Potter. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Biosphere Reserves Association. Thanks for the invite to come and chat today about our work. CBRA is the national organization that supports and promotes the work of Canada's 19 UNESCO biospheres. I should say biosphere reserves. And that's a good point that I should point out here before I go on, that I use biospheres, biosphere reserves, and biosphere regions kind of interchangeably. The official term is UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, and we'll talk about that in a minute. In Canada, though, we have had conversations among the network to talk about maybe changing the word from reserve to region for a number of different reasons. The two I think that would probably have the most importance to this group include region kind of better reflects the whole of society regional approach that biosphere regions take. And there's also the word reserve has a negative history or context within talking about reconciliation. So moving away from the word reserve, but again, it's up to each individual biosphere to determine what they're using. Next slide, please. So biosphere regions are designated by UNESCO. UNESCO is an international body, and therefore there is an international or world network of biosphere regions. There's over 700 worldwide, and they all follow the same format. Next slide. So you can't just decide one day to become a biosphere region. It takes years of community development and community coming together around a common vision. But when that happens, they apply to UNESCO, and if they're successful, they receive the designation of UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. When they receive that designation, there's also a 10-year periodic review where they have to come back every 10 years to tell UNESCO how they're continuing to uphold the standards of the designation. That's a whole separate webinar. If you receive the designation of being a biosphere reserve, you are within the Man in the Biosphere program. And the Man in the Biosphere program is outlined or there's guidelines or ways in which you should be a biosphere that's outlined within the Lima Action Plan. They call it the roadmap. That'll go until 2025, and then there'll be a new one in place that will dictate kind of the changes over the last 10 years and what the new Man in the Biosphere program will look like. But it will follow under these 4 kind of themes. So the main themes and focus of biosphere regions are the conservation of biological and cultural diversity. There's logistical support, which is kind of running through all of them. That's research, monitoring, education, training, those kind of activities. Climate action, reconciliation. And then the last one is the economic development that's socially, culturally, and environmentally sustainable, or sustainable development. So really, biosphere regions are a global or international designation looking at global problems with a local solution, and they are framed within, or they have to be working towards, the implementation of the SDGs, but also the Convention on Biological Diversity, UNDRIP, and a number of other international conventions. Next slide, please. So in that Lima Action Plan, the roadmap of how to be a biosphere, it specifically says that biosphere reserves have a critical role in just within their mandate, their approach of what it means to be a biosphere, but also their connection to the region and the local communities. Next slide. So biosphere regions are internationally recognized as significant areas of biodiversity. They have community support towards an area or a region with a goal where the economy and the environment are not at odds, but complementary. Each biosphere region across the world, including Canada, is made up of the following zones. That is a combination of what's on the landscape already, but also the future vision of what the community would like. So the core area, that's the green in the middle, it's usually the highest area of biodiversity, usually a national or provincial park or some other form of protected area. The buffer zone is the darker blue. It supports the core work through monitoring, education, training, nature-based tourism, those kind of activities. And then the transition area, which is the lighter blue or the kind of gray color, and that's usually where the people live. So before we move on, there's 2 points here to note. Biosphere regions have no regulatory or legal authority in the areas that they are situated in. And the most important aspect of biosphere regions throughout all of the programming, throughout all of the documentation, is that connection of people and nature together, or the inclusion of people within nature. Next slide, please. And Maddie, you can just advance through these, but before we move into the Canadian context, I just wanted to highlight that because we're part of this worldwide network, UNESCO and others have put together resources. So there's examples. So these are just 3 under SDG 3, 7, and 12, but the whole suite of SDGs are there, and it's highlighting examples of biospheres working under these particular SDGs with videos and pictures and more detailed reports around kind of the projects that they're working on. So if we don't have a particular project under a specific SDG, we can go to the World Network to look at what others are doing. And this is just a small snapshot because there's over 700, like I mentioned. So there's just a small sampling of some of the SDG work that biosphere regions are doing across the globe. Next slide, please. So this is the Canadian National Network. So our oldest biosphere region in Canada is Mont Saint-Hilaire in Quebec, formed in 1978. Our newest one is Chatham House Sound in BC. Was just, I can't say last year anymore, in the fall of 2021. And we also have the only Indigenous-led biosphere region in the world in Sachwe, which is up in the north. And next slide, please. So the Canadians in biospheres, or how they're affected or connected. So if you look at the total population of Canada, we estimate that there is about 21 million Canadians that are within 50 kilometers of a biosphere, and about almost 3 million Canadians that are living within a biosphere. And these numbers are a few years old, so the numbers may be even higher now, but they also were hosted by 50 First Nations, as well as 100 municipalities. Next slide, please. So the reason why, the specific reasons about what makes Canada's BRS special is diverse as the network itself. Each biosphere region has its own reason of why they're special, why they're unique, why they're designated. But just a couple of ideas, and again, this could be another webinar on its own. But looking at, like, one of the biospheres is the most diversified agricultural economy in Canada. We have several globally significant important bird areas or migratory flyways and critical migration habitat. There's rare mixed prairie species that are found only in that particular area. And if you're familiar with the key biodiversity areas analysis that's going on right now, we have 17 out of 19 biospheres that have a key biodiversity area that's identified within them. No big surprise given what I've just talked about in terms of biodiversity and the focus or the reason why biospheres become biosphere regions. Next slide, please. So the biospheres are all the same because they're all within that same framework, and yet they're all different at the same time. And that could be based on organizational size and capacity of the nonprofits that support the designation, the age and history of the organization, the population and community needs of the region itself, and the context or the landscape in which the biosphere region is working in. For example, it could be a coastal biosphere in the Bay of Fundy to an agricultural biosphere within the prairies at Redberry Lake, to a biosphere on the West Coast, which is has everything from mountaintops down to the coastal waters. And that really influences how the biosphere region kind of operate and what their priorities are. Next slide, please. So I'll start that again. In an ideal world, all Canadian biospheres would have all of their work that's identified as it pertains to each of the SDGs. And a number of them do. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. But really, all the biospheres are working on all the SDGs, whether directly or indirectly. There's usually a focus, like I mentioned earlier, on SDG 11, 13, 14, and 15, as well as SDG 4. But each biosphere may take one of the other SDGs and focus or include that within their programming. But really, the mandate of biosphere regions as a whole has them working on all of these SDGs. And I'm going to talk about a report in a minute that was produced by the Fundy Biosphere. But there's a great statement in there that says there's really no right way for a biosphere region to engage with the SDGs. How a biosphere chooses to interact or focus on an SDG or grouping of SDGs will really depend on their size, research, capabilities, values, priorities, and needs of the community that they operate within. Next slide, please. So this is a great diagram. It wasn't produced by the Fundy report, but I did snag it from them. I borrowed from them. So most of the biosphere regions in Canada are specifically working on that kind of bottom layer. And then as the capacity and age of the organization increases, so do the complexity of the work, and they kind of move up the different levels of donuts there. Next slide, please. So this is our first example of an SDG project that's happening within Canada. So keeping in mind that all the biosphere regions are working on SDGs. These ones have a specific SDG focus. And so Maddie, I'm going to talk about each of the different components of these wheels. So as I change, if you could just advance through, that'd be helpful. Thanks. So starting with conservation. So the report looks at what SDGs are, how biosphere regions can implement the SDGs, but also how the Fundy biosphere itself can implement the SDGs. So under conservation, biosphere regions can provide awareness to the local community about environmental issues. They can increase awareness about, for example, biodiversity loss. They can support government policies that conserve valuable ecosystems. They become role models and educators, stewards of the environment through habitat restoration, other biodiversity practices, and they can empower and engage with youth to kind of foster that conservation ethic moving forward into the future years. Next slide, please. Economic development. So biospheres can help implement the SDGs by ensuring that all the events that are held are accessible to all, promoting economic growth by supporting youth employment, entrepreneurship, sustainable tourism, local economies. They can assist and promote the marginalized communities living within their region, and they can ensure that the economic benefits of development that's happening have a benefit to the entire community. For education, they can encourage and promote SDGs as topics of research and education within the region. They can support incubation or around innovation for sustainable development solutions. And they can help to implement SDG solutions. For climate action, all of the themes, biospheres can help to support and apply for funding to implement some of these projects, not only for themselves, but for the region or other partners. But for climate action, they're focusing on nature-based solutions, supporting local legislation to help mitigate the effects of climate change, and trying to find and understand and communicate those local stressors and contributors to climate change. Under reconciliation, that's really looking at kind of internally as an organization for biospheres, but they can focus on what they can learn about the Indigenous peoples, how they can support and build relationships, demonstrate respect, and renew the commitment to reconciliation, and kind of help support the needs of the Indigenous nations that are hosting the biospheres. And then lastly, the organizational governance. Biospheres can include their governance and operational policies that are in line with SDGs. They can facilitate some cross-sectoral dialogue within the community, which we'll hear about in a minute. And they can demonstrate their own commitment to the SDGs and communicate that to the community. And next slide, please. So the next project is from the Clayoquot Sound Biosphere Trust, which is a biosphere reserve, but again, not using the word reserve in its name. So the image on the left is the image of the front cover of a document that they put together, identifying 5 different ways in which they are working on the SDGs. So the first image on the upper right is the vital signs reporting. So that's looking at SDG 10 and looking at economic trends within the community that were contributing to wealth inequity. And kind of parallel or complementary to that is the image on the bottom right. And all of these reports are available on the Clayoquot Sound Biosphere website. The image on the bottom right is the living wage calculation. So that's looking at what a family of 4 would need to make to have a very bare bones budget to be able to survive and live within the Clayoquot Sound area. Again, looking at SDG 10 and trying to reduce inequalities. Next slide, please. And this page again, this is so the third way that they identified how they can work with SDGs is the vital conversation. So that's the like cross-sectoral community dialogue around different topics, but with an SDG lens. So they call it vital conversations, and they've had conversations around sustainable tourism, empowering youth, and other topics, but considering them within the SDG lens. Pathway 4 was education. So they were looking at kind of bringing everyone together, multiple levels of government to come together for a common vision around sustainability. And they use the SDGs as kind of a platform or a way in which to discuss that. But they've also identified programs. So they have a program called the West Coast Nest, which is, they call it academic tourism. So it's people coming to the area to learn, and you know, Clayoquot Sound is a huge tourist draw for a lot of people that want to be doing nature-based tourism. And they have courses in which these tourists, both locals and tourists, can take to learn about different aspects of the region. And one of them, or a number of them, I should say, is around the SDGs. And then the last pathway, there's no image there, but it's around looking at ways that they can invest in the community to take the community or divest the community away from fossil fuel dependencies. And those are conversations that are happening across the community. So the next project example, the third one, is looking at, this is from Akatsum House Sound, which is the newest biosphere. And because they're a new biosphere, you know, there are changes around, or depending on when you've become a biosphere. And because they become a biosphere when they did, they had to identify kind of their work plan as it responds to the SDGs in a more kind of direct and clear way. And so they have on their website, they have all the SDGs, they have what the SDG is, what the Canadian response is, and what the actions that are happening within their biosphere as it responds to each of the different SDG icons. And they're using that as a way to promote to the community, both, yes, we're a new biosphere region and we've just become designated, but also this is the SDG and our work and how they're related. And then the last example, last but not least, is Mount Arrowsmith. So that's in BC as well. They hosted a Getting to Know the SDGs forum. So they brought municipalities from across the region together to talk about SDGs, why they're important, how they can be implemented within their local municipal planning, but also the bigger kind of municipality and government framework in which they work in. So I'm going to close out my presentation just by saying the next slide that there's more information. So there's one episode on every biosphere under the Striking Balance documentary series, which I highly recommend. There are more information on the website as well as my email, which is there. And we have a particularly good series of reconciliation papers and videos about how individual biosphere regions are undertaking reconciliation. And we also have a fantastic 2-minute national video, which I put in my introductory chat in the waterfall. And I think with that, I'll close it out. And Roz, do we do questions now, or would you like to do some additional discussion and questions at the end?
Well, thank you so much, Kate. Let's open it up to questions, comments. The best way, I'm not sure if I can see everybody. I'll try. Okay. So the best way would be to use the where it says reaction and it says raise hand. And then we can have kind of a speaker's order. I could start off if you like, and maybe other, oh, Janice has a question.
I do. Thank you very much, Kate, for that really informative presentation, and thanks as well for the information about the Canadian Environmental Network. My question relates to the connectivity or the overlap between species at risk zones and areas and biosphere regions or reserves. How are those two entities reflecting each other's interests?
So I'll preface my answer with I'm not a biologist, so I can get a more fulsome answer from one of my biologists. But my understanding is that there are several biospheres, not everyone, but there are several biospheres who have been identified as a species at risk priority place. And so in which case, for example, like off the top of my head, I can think of Georgian Bay, Waterton, Long Point, to name a few. So they are working with species at risk, in particular, like Georgian Bay is working on turtle monitoring and collection of eggs and rearing of the turtles and releasing them back into the wild. So there is a lot of connection. There is a lot of connection between species at risk and biospheres. Not everyone is a federally identified priority place, and there is that key biodiversity areas, which includes some species at risk. But I can find out more information if you're looking for more detail.
Yeah, thank you.
Lindray.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, that was really wonderful, Kate. Thank you so much for the presentation. As I described in the waterfall, I'm sort of new to Canada. I come from South Africa, but I actually did work with some of the biosphere reserves in the Western Cape, and it's really fascinating. The question I sort of have is a two-parter. The one is, I've recently been wondering, everybody that is starting to integrate the SDGs into their planning, it's technically supposed to sort of have been achieved by 2030, right? It's this, the SDGs for 2030. It's 7 years to go, which is nothing in terms of planning and management. So the sort of the first part would be to ask about what happens after the 7 years. You know, I imagine all these programs you're doing, they're obviously wonderful, and the achievement or the integration of SDGs. But what happens after the 7 years and sort of what's long-term planning? And then my second question is around, do you work with landscape planners or landscape researchers? Because I'm looking into the use of very large regions and going into the future in terms of nature, conservation and in terms of development, rural and urban development. I'm very curious to know about the man and biosphere reserves and how they integrate that. Thanks.
Yeah, those are two great questions. So I think the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda, you're right, is up for renewal, or it's supposed to be completed by 2030. I think given the mandate of, irregardless of the SDGs, of the mandate of the Biosphere Region Program, unless there was a huge shift, which I don't anticipate there being, I think they're going to continue on with sustainable development activities, because it's, I have an executive member who tells me that if the environmentalists and the economists are pissed off, then we're doing a great job, because we're in the middle, right? It's not purely conservation. We're not purely like economics. It's somewhere in the middle. So I think in terms of like after, it's similar, I think, to the the COP15, right? We were working on these biodiversity goals and we're supposed to have achieved them, right? And now we're looking at what the next phase is, like the post 2020 global biodiversity framework. I see it in a similar situation for the SDGs. And where the biosphere regions are going to continue working on sustainable development, whether the SDGs are here or not. I share some of your sentiments around, there's a lot to do in 7 years. However, I also think, like in the case of the biosphere reserves, I think there's a lot of work happening that's not being documented, not being recorded well, because the biosphere, like we are all doing SDG work, and yet we are not part of the necessarily like the recording or the showcase of like what's being done. We contribute to the voluntary reporting, they have it every couple of years. But we don't have the resources, or not all of the biospheres have the resources to specifically quantify our impact to the SDGs. So I think there's a lot more work being done that's being counted, but there's also so much more work to be done. So that's question one. Question two, the landscape level planning. That's a lot of the conversations we're having with Parks Canada right now. So 11 of the 19 biospheres have national parks at their core. And we're having conversations with them because biosphere regions kind of look at that bigger landscape. So they're looking at that. They're not looking at one specific parcel, like a national park maybe, but they're looking at the bigger landscape. So we're having some conversations with them around that, is that we can provide that landscape level, like looking at the region, right? Moving from reserve to region for a reason, right? Looking at that bigger region and the plans, both from the community, but also biologically, biodiversity, and looking at the plan for the bigger region is kind of at the core of what we do. So I'm happy to have a chat with you offline in more detail.
Anyone have any other comments or questions? That question actually raises something in my mind that I'm a bit curious about, is where does the support for Biosphere Reserve Association come from? And so where does your funding come from? Are there a lot of volunteers? Organizationally, what are the challenges that you're seeing, that you're facing?
So we have the 19 biospheres as well as the national organization. Everyone is their own independent organization, and within the designation package, but also as part of their core mandate, they're responsible for independent fundraising on their own. As a national group, I do my best to try and either have a network-wide funding opportunity, or help with funding proposals that are affecting more than one biosphere. But our funding, actually, we have a great graphic in our annual report, and it showcases. So collectively, as a network, we are bringing like $9 million into these areas. So as a network, $9 million. We have 30,000 hours of volunteer time across the network cumulatively. We have funding right now from Environment Canada to work on biodiversity. So each of the 19 sites, as well as myself at the national organization, we have funding for biodiversity for 2 years, with the possible extension of 2 more years, specifically around biodiversity. But it's a huge concern that we have biospheres at different levels, different budgets, different timing, different histories, how long they've been in existence. So we're all at different stages, and some have kind of cracked that nut and have done really well, and they are sustainable, and others are kind of on their journey to figuring out what that means. So it's private foundations, government grants, individual donations, which I don't typically do at the national level, because I'd rather the individual has a bigger tie to a specific place, than at the national level. Municipalities or different levels of government. So there's a number of different kind of ways in which they get funding, but each funding formula is a bit different, and some are more sustainable than others.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Lindre again.
Thanks, Kate. Sorry, I just wanted to add, a thought just came out to me. So, Kate, I was also at COP15 in December. I was working with the CBD in the Secretariat. And I think the only thing that might change with the SDGs in 2030, it's this huge push in the UN to add metrics to all the targets that they have. I mean, obviously with the global biodiversity framework, they were trying to fit in 30 by 30. And I think one part was because when the SDGs now, when they start the negotiation process, which will probably start in the next few years, it's because they want to add those targets in. So maybe that's the only difference that will come in.
Great, thanks, Andre.
One of the things that I've noticed as we reach the midpoint is the effort to think about the SDGs more broadly, and there have been criticisms of them, and not necessarily of the process by which they were developed, but the scope and the content. And a lot of things it's actually amazing how quickly things have changed, even in the last few years, where human rights, environmental justice, circular economy, a lot of those things are kind of there, but they're not necessarily acknowledged specifically in the SDG framework. And I suspect that probably one of the things that will happen by 2030 is that people will say, well, can the SDG framework start to incorporate some of these other newer agendas that have come forward, and to start to move them towards a connection between them, right? So one of the things that's so amazing about the biosphere reserve or the biosphere region concept is we're not talking about, a world and nature that's outside, it's not separate. One thing that kind of intrigues me is whether we can think of an urban biosphere region, right? So often we think biosphere region must be something natural that we're protecting, but the biosphere region concept explicitly says this is not something separate like a wilderness that's sort of set in stone and never going to change and never going to be something new and something different and remaking itself in new ways. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
So if I could just add to that, one of the other reasons why we're thinking of changing from reserve to region is because when you think of nature conservation and a reserve, it is that like put it behind a glass box and nobody ever use it, which has its place, but that's just not what we are trying to do. And at COP15, there was the announcement of Quebec City is going to try to be a biosphere reserve, and it's heavily urbanized, but there has to be enough of the like what would be the core area, like of the significant biodiversity to be considered, but yet it also has, a pretty immense transition area and a buffer area that would have to, it would be interesting to see the kind of the urban interplay between all of the zones. So you can watch out for Quebec City because they announced at COP15 that they are looking to become kind of the first urban biosphere reserve in Canada.
Oh, wow, interesting. I have Anne Kath, can we have Anne Kath and then Laurel? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I just put the camera on now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Kate, I come from an experience in Bolivia in South America with conservationists and with the conservation of biosphere. And there were many issues in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. I've been gone now for the last 10 years. I haven't been back to Bolivia much, but a lot of the issues were that the conservationist movement and even the UNESCO naming of the conservation of the biosphere area or region, it's not just that the word reserve was resonating negatively, it was that it was being managed by people who are not the Indigenous peoples, while at the same time the Indigenous peoples were struggling for recognition of their territory and their rights to what they called development with identity. In other words, they wanted to be part of the management, and it also included economic development for their sustainability. So I suspect that a lot of that has been going on in Canada as well, on Turtle Island. And I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about that. It's not frictions, the tensions that can happen between different movements for conservation, but at the same time for Indigenous right to territory and self-governance of territories. That said, I also wanted to say that to me goes well beyond, I mean, all this started in the 70s and will continue beyond the SDGs. So I'm not worried about the 7 years, by the way. I just think it will go on, just like you said, it's going on. It's not necessarily always recorded, but the movements are there and it's great. Yeah, so I'm just opening up the topic for you, Kate, if you have anything from that experience that you could tell us about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll put the link for the reconciliation papers. So some really good examples there of what the biosphere regions are doing. And at the same time, like with everything, I always say it's great because it's a network, but it's also not great because it's a network, and they all have varying degrees of capacity. So everyone is on their different stage of the reconciliation journey. We have some like Manicouagan and Pishka in Quebec who are co-running a research station and they have co-governance. Niagara Escarpment, they're looking at co-governance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Georgian Bay has a cultural advisory council. So there are a lot of ways in which the biospheres are incorporating reconciliation and supporting their Indigenous hosts, because it's their land first, right? So they are hosting our biospheres on their land. And I think one of the great things about biosphere regions, but also makes it hard to kind of promote about them, is they are the behind the scenes organizations in a lot of ways. So usually they are the ones that are helping support the nations to do the work that they have identified as priorities. But in doing so, it's not that kind of big flashy, like, look at us, we've done all this great work. It's the supporting, it's the like convening role that the biospheres take.
Laurel?
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you very much for the great presentations. I did want to mention that one of the things that I've seen, because I've been involved in this over 30, 40 years, and my background is in regional planning, city planning, and as an environmental professional as well. So we've been kind of going at this for so many decades. And, I think what we're talking about when we talk about a biosphere reserve is really sustainable regional planning, design and development. And so a lot of the practices that are being advocated here under this framework of the biosphere reserves is essentially the same kinds of values as professionals that we have to try to achieve. And we're dealing with so many different stakeholders, and we're at the urban rural fringe in a lot of situations. I've also seen a lot of interesting types of sort of issues around national parks and multiple use protected areas. I've been involved in the design of a number of them, some internationally and some in Canada. And I think this idea of people being embedded in nature has been something that's been near and dear to my heart. And in fact, a lot of the work when I was in my early days working in Nepal, with developing the Annapurna Conservation Area project, really this kind of movement towards this framework that we call biosphere reserve started a lot earlier, in the environmental movement, when we started to stop some of those fences that were basically cutting people out of national parks and created violent conflicts and inequalities at the fringe, right, of protected areas. So I would say going back to the 1980s was the very first time that, and it could not have been just the first time, but let's just say those were the early days of trying to integrate people into protected areas. And so, one of the things that I love the Biosphere Reserve framework and regional framework is just, what it comes down to, though, is because it doesn't have legal clout, so to speak, in these regions, we have to kind of take we have to be working with municipalities, we have to be working with professional teams and so on that are part of, municipal and regional kind of planning districts, so to speak, in order to resolve a lot of these issues. And if there's not that link with that, then it becomes difficult, because you could have a policy statement saying that we want to achieve all these things, but in fact, you have other activities going on, in municipal decisions or regional, and even parks, right? Parks are not always well accepted, and partly because some parks are in an old versus new model, right? And so parks, there's a whole spectrum of what we would call a park or protected area. And then we've got the whole mix of Indigenous people as well, with, Indigenous guardians and all of that. So, it's going to be really an interesting thing going forward over the next 7 years to kind of see, with all these levels of jurisdiction, how does this framework of biosphere reserves work out so that they can become more effective on the ground? Because, identifying, biodiversity areas and all these things are just, and then cultural features, and that's one sort of level of assessment. But then we have all this change around, who's in power, how are they making decisions, what's going on legally. And I just wanted to sort of give that kind of broader concern, because, in theory, it's excellent. I love the frameworks of the biosphere reserves. I love the protection of world heritage and all of that. I'm just seeing, because I'm a seasoned practitioner in the craft over decades, how much conflict goes on the ground between all these multiple jurisdictions. So I'm going to just kind of, and if there's solutions, Kate, that you'd like to share with us a little bit more about how, this bridging can take place between all of this, and grassroots, professional, government, it's really quite a mix now.
Well, when you figure that out, let me know what the solution is. But I would say, like, biosphere regions can act as the conveners, so they're a neutral third party, so they can bring a lot of those people together to have those conversations. But I'll just leave it there, because I know Rosalind wanted to join in there.
Oh no, I was just going to sort of frame it for you, Kate, a little bit. So to my mind, it seems like it's, what is the law, what is mandated versus how education, in a way. And I actually would love to hear more about the biosphere regions educational programs as well. It's true that we have to work within this framework of law, and there's, in Canada, with a federal system, we even have more complexities because of that, municipalities. And we also work within a democratic framework, right? So that means at some level, the people have to speak. The people just need to be a part of the decision making. And so I wonder, I recognize the issue of, well, if something's not part of the law, how do we move it forward? And I've been thinking about this a lot in my research work. So, but at the same time, I also wonder if there isn't a benefit for something not being part of the law and mandated and forced, and sort of, this is the regulation and this is the way it must be regulated. It can become static, as we know, with the parks and the protected areas frameworks. Just maybe, Kate, if you wouldn't mind, unless if others have questions as well. I noticed Janice has raised her hand again, but maybe just to think about what the more of the educational role there. Janice?
Well, just prompted by your observations about, the law or the legal codification of some of the things that we're talking about. So one of the wonderful things about policy and how law is made, if there's enough public and or private sector and or nonprofit sector interest in seeing something protected or something or some concept developed that isn't reflected in the law. Great thing is we can, through public pressure, public engagement, proposal of policies, advocate for these kinds of new legal developments. It's very exciting, I think, because we have seen a lot of positive steps in this regard. I was in discussions a couple of days ago about how inspiring New Zealand has been, as I think the first jurisdiction to afford the legal rights of personhood to a river. I think Roslyn, wasn't the Wanungi River the first?
Wanui River, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the first.
One of the first. So these big things can be made into codified legal constructs that then have all the force and effect and power and influence that goes along with it. So just
Thank you.
that observation.
I just add that there are some biospheres in the World Network that are legislated, that are part of the home country's national legislation. And I think there's positive and or negatives and positives to having it be part of the legislation. And on the one hand, being part of the legislation also means that there's a commitment from the federal government and hopefully some funding around that. But then there's also the static piece that Rosalind talked about, and the ability of the biospheres to be somewhat nimble and responding to community needs, which there may not be as much ability to be able to do that if it was turned into a law. There's also, there is a misconception of, UNESCO, like this is imposing something on a region. It's another layer of legislation that's being imposed on a region that UNESCO is going to come and jump out of helicopters, and police what's going on in the area. Obviously that's a silly extreme, but there is that negative community reaction that comes with yet another layer of protection, and yet with another layer of protection, it's also doing even more good. So I think there's pros and cons, the benefits and for both sides.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with you there that there sometimes can be a type of a negative perception around any form of regulation. We certainly seen that in the South Okanagan with the attempts over the years to have a national park down there, and the taking away of the rights of local people to sort of do what they want to do in the outback of their communities. And I also sort of see a bit of negative backlash against the United Nations as well. And, as much as some of that backlash seems a bit absurd because of sort of the way that, I perceive the good work that a lot of, UNESCO and so on has been doing over the decades, there is this fear that even, as you say, something like a biosphere reserve, has actually doesn't, have a legislative kind of, it doesn't have the teeth or whatever you want to call it, that people think that it does. There still is a backlash sometimes. And that's not with everybody, because some people want that and some people do not want that. And there's certainly communities that have, this kind of hands off, these are our regions, this is our resources. We don't want, big brother, national or international getting involved in our region. And sometimes with Indigenous groups too, we're dealing with one in Peru, there's a lot of, concern about the actual frame, like who is the one, what is the managing, authority of this, right? So, yeah. I just wanted to agree with you basically on that, because I'm seeing it come up too. And, you know, it's a bit horrifying when many of us have been for decades trying to get policies and guidelines and protections for wetlands, for riparian corridors, for biodiversity, environmentally sensitive areas, and then cultural areas, and all these good things that we're trying to do. And we know that we need some legislation to really make it real, so that, you know, developers just can't go out and wipe out this area, which they can if they don't, or other, you know, industries or whatever. But at the same time, we're also listening to a lot of backlash against any form of authority. And, you know, and I'm trying to find educational ways, perhaps, of trying to lessen that sort of reflex that's coming out from some sectors of the community. So,
Kate, is it all right if we just put all of our next 3 speakers together, and then you could respond at the end? Does that sound like a plan? All right. So then we have Anne-Kath, and then Janice, and then Darren.
Well, it's funny because I was raising my hand to say, Kate, I so much agree with you. And then Laurel spoke, and it's like, yes. So I'm with the BC Council for International Cooperation, but previous to that, for many years, decades, I lived in Bolivia, and we were working just a company with the indigenous peoples. So it wasn't project management, it was a company. My life was with them. The way that they organized, and the organizations that you mentioned, Kate, I think all the work that's being done that is not highlighted, that's not shown, all the solidarity, etc. It was so intense in all of South America and then Latin America with the COICA, the Coordination of Indigenous Peoples of the Amazon Basin. And in each country, in each region, etc., there was just this fantastic network together with international allies like IRDIA, the International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs. And I think there's so many lessons that we Canadians don't think about looking for outside our environment, and that there would be so much. I can't know right now what would be the best lessons that we can learn from there, but I remember the incredible moment when we had one of the territories, I'm part Bolivian by marriage and children, so I say we, one of the territories became conservation of biosphere and indigenous territory. Like, I think that was in the 90s when it was named, you know, it was in the full name. And that meant so many conciliation, not just reconciliation, but conciliation, negotiations, all these decades of dialogues. So what is it that made things work? And learning from that, I would think, is part of what UNESCO internationally tries to do. But again, it's not necessarily the United Nations bodies. It's those entities that you mentioned, Kate, that are doing all the work behind the scenes that we have to connect with. And maybe you're already connecting, and I see that Laurel is connected in that. So great to meet you.
nice to meet you.
Yeah. And Janice, did you withdraw? Or
I did, yeah. Sorry, that hand up was left over from my last
Oh,
question.
okay.
My apologies.
Darren.
And so, well, first I agree with Anne and Catherine that there's so many things here in Canada that we should be looking beyond Canada, the United States for lessons, and you know, this is one of those areas for sure. I just wanted to react a bit about backlash being the old white man. Most of that backlash comes from old white men, I bet. You know, I mean, that's what we saw in the South Okanagan. I mean, it's coming from people who are used to getting their own way, and when you have organizations, whether they're, you know, regional or provincial or national or international like this one, those organizations allow people whose voices can't be heard above the yelling to be heard. And that's so important. I mean, just because someone shouts or because someone has a truck doesn't mean that their opinion is more important than the opinion of the majority.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
So we had a lot of commentary there from the international side and Indigenous viewpoints, and what do we do when there's opposition? How do we incorporate that? Kate, any last reflections?
I think this is great. Always when I'm getting with a group who knows, but you know, it was willing to kind of push or investigate, ask questions. You know, it's always making me look at biosphere regions from different angles, or, you know, revisiting concepts that you're not always working on in your day-to-day kind of in the administration things. So I thank you for this really in-depth and engaging conversation around biospheres.
Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing with us today, and to all of our very well-informed and experienced speakers and questions. The last part of the meeting we put aside for what we call basically networking and sharing. So here's your opportunity to share any upcoming events or anything your organization is working on, to connect directly with the speaker or with others on the call. So I'm going to just turn it over to Maddie, who can say a little bit about the upcoming events in our speaker series. And then we can open it up to anybody who'd like to share a little bit of just for networking purposes. Maddie?
Yeah, so thank you, Kate, first of all. So we do have 3 more sessions coming up over the next couple months. So I'm just going to put in the chat here the link to the Eventbrite, it's called a collection. So it's basically all 4 of these sessions in one place. So you can register for the next ones if you want, or if you're available. So those will have different speakers, but sort of same thing. We'll be talking about different aspects of the SDGs. So you can check those out. Also with RCEN, we will be doing a speed networking event it's in the works still, but planned for perhaps the 2nd week of February. So you can keep an eye out for that. And if you aren't already, I'm going to throw in the link to our newsletter, so you can sign up for that, and you'll get notifications about any events coming up within our network, as well as other organizations across Canada. So hopefully we'll get our speed networking event up and coming soon. And if any of you join, that would be amazing to have your expertise and to meet other people in this space as well. And I don't know if we have anything else on the go. I think, Roz, you had a few SDG related things to share as well.
I've put 2 in the chat.
Nice.
One is the climate teach-in on March 29th, and SDG week, which is, I think, going to be the first time that we have a national SDG week brought forward by different groups. I think it's UBC and a number of nonprofits, as well as the national alliances, which are working on this. So there's going to be lots of events coming up, both on the sort of substantive side, but also on the education side. So those of you who are educators. Is there anything else people would like to share?
Roz, just so is this a formal week that you said there's like multiple organizations? Is this being led by a specific organization, or this is new to me?
And Kath might have some details on that.
I don't have the details on hand. I'm actually preparing the details on International Development Week instead of
Right.
SDG right now.
Yeah. So yes, of course, International Development Week.
Yes, I did want
February.
to raise that there will be events across the country. So in BC, obviously, we have some events, but look out for events across the country for International Development Week. Some are about climate change, migration, the effect of climate change on women, or women's leadership in that. So we are councils across the whole country. There's 8 councils, provincial and territorial, and we each manage our own events, but we're one country, everything's virtual, or many things are virtual. So look out for those, because of all the learning we get by sharing and hearing the other voices. In BC, we've tried as much as possible to not be bringing in like beneficiaries. We don't use that word. It's more bringing in leaders of the global South who can tell us their experience that we might learn from. Yeah. Back to you. Oh, it's February 5th to 11th.
Awesome. Yeah. So SDG week is UBC, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and Colleges and Institutes Canada are the 3 named supporters of that. And so I think it will have an educational focus, but I think also there's scope for lots of different discussions to have. I do want to mention that I'm glad, we've got a smaller group than we had when we started, but Lindray, Janice, Laurel, Darren are all in, and Kath are all like BC based, Vancouver, Kelowna. It might be an idea for us to think about getting together, and Katura and Eric, you've been a little bit quiet, not to put you on the spot, but if there's anything you'd like to share about where you are, what you're doing. No. Okay, well, sincere thank you. Much appreciation to everybody for your very thoughtful ideas and comments, and for your support. So
applause.
Yeah, thank you so much for facilitating, Roz.
And thank you to Maddie for her wonderful organization of the speaker series.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Maddie too. Yes.
Thank you all.
Of course.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks all. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Nice to meet you all.
Bye.
Because I'm on my phone, I can't find where to hang up.
I know, I can never figure out how to leave either when I'm on.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
You guys are going to have to kick me out.